Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today on crisis communication in the age of Trump. I think we're going to get cracking because I suspect we're going to have a lot to get through and a lot of questions, a lot of fascinating topics to cover today. So we'll get started, and then if people are joining in the meantime, then that's absolutely fine. So I'm Claire Germany. I'm co-chair of the PRCA's Crisis Comms group, and I'm thrilled to be chairing this session today. I'm sure it's not just me who's been having multiple discussions about Trump in the last few weeks, astonished chats in the office about whatever he's said or done now, thinking about our personal media approach in terms of, what's happening in the wider climate, or just chatting with friends or family. And I assume that's why we're all here today, because we're just very fascinated by this subject. I think personally for me, the most depressing conversations that I've been having with my friends or family are the ones where they say they don't want to watch the news anymore and they're just, completely disengaging, which obviously working in our profession, we can't do. But actually, one of the topics we will get on to discussing later today is resilience. And actually in this kind of environment, how do we keep ourselves, sane and strong and keep going on? So as we all know, the re-election of Trump has brought about significant changes in the political and cultural landscape. It's impacted businesses and organisations worldwide. So, whether we all work in UK businesses that have no operations in the US, we're still feeling the effects of this, and it's still, something that's going on a lot in the media. Many companies have faced numerous crisis communication challenges. So consumer-facing brands have had to navigate complexities of new tariffs, trade policies, and over here in the UK, we're keeping one eye across the pond on attitudes around DEI and sustainability as that becomes even more divisive. Polarised public opinion has put companies in difficult positions, balancing core missions with the expectations of a very divided audience. And then this isn't new to us. This is something I think we've felt since Brexit, if not before then, but it's certainly intensifying. So in today's session, we're going to dive into all of these fascinating topics, exploring how to manage crisis comms effectively in this evolving environment. We've got two amazing speakers here, Miles and Harry, who I'll be introducing fully shortly, and they're going to be sharing their learnings and insights, and then we'll go to a Q&A. So feel free to put your questions in the chat box throughout their talk, and then we'll come to a good chunky half-an-hour Q&A session at the end. So we'll come to all of your questions then rather than interrupting their flow. So thank you very much for joining us today. Let's get started. So first up, we've got Miles Evans, who is Head of External Affairs at Openreach. He's going to help us understand how to apply lessons in crisis comms to a world that is ever changing, and it is changing fast. So Miles has had a diverse career spanning roles in Westminster, Thames Water, and now at Openreach. And he's also part of the PRCA's Public Affairs Board. So take it away, Miles.
Well, thank you, Claire, for a very generous introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. I mean, in terms of just picking up on your first theme there, Claire, right, around kind of the speed at which all this is happening. So just to sort of give this some context. So I left the office last week, probably. It takes me an hour and a half door to door to get from London to where I live. Got on the train, got on the tube, got home, put my kids to bed, looked at my phone, and Trump had been on the phone, had a discussion with Putin, sidelined Zelensky, and then we're going to go meet in Saudi Arabia and talk about thrashing out a peace deal for what's happening in Ukraine. That's an hour and a half. That's me just literally picking up my bag and going home. So you're absolutely right when you sort of talk about kind of the immediacy of all of this. I think for my remarks, I think I will probably put them into three buckets, I guess. I mean, the first thing to just sort of look at is Trump and Trump 2.0. So there are lessons to learn from the first term, but I think we're encountering a very different Trump this time around. Where that then kind of intersects with business. So I think I'll pick up, Claire, on the themes that you've mentioned around sort of sustainability and D&I initiatives. And then I'll sort of conclude by thinking a little bit about my experience of doing crisis comms, the basic hygiene factors, that you put in place and how you can apply those to an ever-moving, ever-changing kind of situation with Trump in the White House. So in terms of a different Trump, I sort of take a slightly different view to the one, I guess, that you might get if you just sort of listen to the news every night, which is that he is this kind of shoot from the hip, says the first thing that comes to his brain. You know, there's no kind of logic, there's no kind of thread around kind of the things that he's doing. I kind of disagree with that. I think what we're seeing this time round is Trumpism, which has clear trends to it. And I think the first thing to point to is the transactional nature of the way in which he is governing. So what I mean by that is he's a very binary character. Things are black and white, and he's all about making deals, right? I still have not read Art of the Deal. I'm not sure I ever will, but there you go. It's kind of all in there for you if you want some bedtime reading, I assume. And you see it predominantly already in the early days of this administration through his foreign policy efforts. So the first thing he really sort of says about the situation in Ukraine is, well, you know, the US is owed money. It's transactional, right? We've provided this security arrangement for you for 3 years. If you want us to keep going on and doing that, let's talk about your rare earth minerals. Same thing with sort of underpinning European security, right? The Americans will continue to underpin European security, but you've got to pay for it. There's a pounds and pence value attached to everything. And you see it in the way he applies his tariffs, you know, tariffs to the Canadians, tariffs to the Mexicans, tariffs coming to the European Union. You know, it's all about transacting something. And it's largely due to money. And how does America win? It's about kind of winning. So there is a logic. We may not like it, we may not agree with it, but there is kind of a transactional logic to kind of where he's approaching things from. The other thing I would say, and I think this is the thing that I struggle to get my head around, and maybe it's the same, probably the same for a number of us on this call. He has a very different values system. And sort of kind of growing up sort of post-Cold War, the world has looked a certain way for quite a long time. There's this kind of special relationship that sort of exists, certainly between us kind of in the UK and with the States. We've kind of got into this rhythm of kind of sharing that kind of value system. It's kind of all going out of the window. And if you think about one of Britain's great attributes, it's soft power, right? We are the world masters in soft power. It's language, it's cultural exports, it's all of that. Trump doesn't do soft power because it's not transactional and it's not black and white. It's that kind of gray, kind of fuzzy stuff that can be quite difficult to be tangible, to be understood. So I think there is a logic to what he is doing. And the final thing I would just say about Trump is some of the things that he is coming out with should not be a surprise. So I will profess, I have never sat there and listened to these 3-4 hour long campaign rallies. I mean, there were enough, right, over the course of the last year in the lead up to the US election. But he's been consistent in what he said. So, you know, the fact that, you know, he doesn't seem to believe in the climate science, the fact that he doesn't seem to want to lean into, you know, D&I initiatives in corporate America, or indeed in the American government, none of that's a shock. It shouldn't be a shock because, you know, he's telegraphed that from his first term, and he's been very clear about that over the kind of course of his campaign. So I think that's kind of what I would say at this stage about Trump and what we're seeing from this kind of second term. I think the second point then is the kind of the so what. So how does that then influence British business? And Claire's sort of signposted this, and I'm going to pick it up, that the piece around kind of the sustainability and the kind of D&I piece. And I think a lot of this goes to the heart and the core of your culture as a business and what your values are. Now, this is quite a difficult thing, clearly, because every business is different. You know, if you're headquartered in the States, you know, and the UK is kind of an outpost, then, you know, you sort of tend to take the lead perhaps from America. If you're a purely British business, maybe the outcome is slightly different, but the principles kind of remain. And this is where it's really important to kind of understand what that is for the business that you work in, far more so probably than it ever used to be. So if you take Openreach, so the business that I work for, strong sustainability credentials in what we do, right? Clear commitments made to regulators, to government, to unions about becoming net zero by 2031. So we've got the second largest van fleet in the country. So only Royal Mail have got more vans than us. And now I've mentioned that this afternoon, I guarantee you'll go out and you'll see an Openreach van driving around somewhere. About 20,000 vans. Commitment is to electrify the fleet. Got 4,500 on the road at the moment. That's baked into what we do. And we're very clear that that's the right thing to do. It makes sense for our business. It makes sense for the environment. It makes sense for our people. And we're kind of on that path already. So in our respect, you know, we've stress tested that against this notion that actually the prevailing narrative from the States is, what do you want to do that for? And we're going to continue on that path. But it's difficult and it's tricky. Now, where the nuances start to apply is that, for example, here in the UK, you know, we have a centre-left government. We don't have a right-wing government here, it's centre-left. And this is a government elected to deliver transformational workers' rights. Now, it's kind of gone quiet a little bit on that, but if you cast your mind back to sort of when they were elected, July, August time, lots of talk about, you know, getting rid of the most of 0 hours contracts, looking at, you know, day one rights for workers, you know, how do you really sort of put the power in the hands of the employee? And that will come back again. And I think the challenge that you've got as a UK-based business is, even if you wanted to unpick some of the things that you've been working on and delivering around sustainability or D&I, there are questions around, could you? And actually, if you don't, will government make you? And that's a very different kind of interaction between British business and British state than it is for those businesses perhaps that are, you know, based in America and bidding on kind of American government contracts with all these kind of other things sort of in and around the mix. So maybe get into that in the questions, but I think that's a really kind of interesting kind of distinction to draw. And then the final part is, are there hygiene factors that we can all take in delivering crisis comms which apply to what we're talking about, apply to the age of Trump? And I think there are, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I think the first is, and I'm probably teaching people on this call to suck eggs, you know, educating your teams. Is everybody really clear about what their role is in this process? And, you know, when I was at Thames Water, I sort of ended up doing crisis comms, by the way, by accident. I wasn't sort of employed to do crisis comms by the business. It was just kind of what the business needed. And so I very much kind of filled that void for them. But we were very clear, you know, we were dealing with infrastructure failure. When the infrastructure fails, what do? Right? Somebody's doing internal comms, somebody's doing social media, somebody's doing the external stuff, somebody's giving press interviews, and then there's a whole operational response that kind of is at site and making stuff happen. So do you really clearly understand when stuff happens and stuff goes wrong, who is doing what and who is accountable for what? It's a basic, simple thing, but you'd be surprised how many times, you know, stuff goes wrong, you're into crisis mode, and everybody just kind of looks at each other and goes, oh God, it's actually happening. What are we actually going to do? So I think there's an element of that. I think there's a bit around understanding kind of what the trigger points are. So, you know, again, this is where the kind of my first kind of comments around trend analysis come into this. When do you expect those trigger points and what do you think they might be? And what do they kind of elicit going forward? That's a whole kind of corporate affairs kind of risk management response that is looking at everything in the macro and going, okay, if this happens, that, you know, that initiates plan A or plan B. Again, it comes back to that kind of preparedness kind of state. I think there's a bit about resilience and organizational resilience to deal with some of this stuff. So again, you know, my experience here was when I first sort of started doing the kind of crisis comms stuff at Thames, it was the preserve of the press office. And I was one of 4 press officers. So we were the only people staffing out of hours rotas. We were the only people kind of doing incident response. And by the time I left, every single person within that corporate affairs team of 100 plus, everybody was on a rota to do something because it was just too much for 4 people to manage on repeat. And because, as we all know, it requires more than just a press response, putting out those press lines. It requires a whole kind of multifaceted response to lean into kind of all those agencies involved with whatever that kind of crisis was. And I think finally, and I think probably crucially important when we come to think about Trump, and I'm sure we'll touch on this in the questions as well, and I'm sure Harry will pick this up, is misinformation. How do you in this world kind of counter that? And that's not just kind of what you're going to say, that's also how you kind of caveat that internally. So, I've always taken a view, all those people that work in your business are your biggest advocates by association. Openreach, we've got 30,000 people that we could employ to go out and tell the narrative and tell the story. But what is it? And how do you kind of exercise it? And how do you actually make sure that you are quickly and coherently demonstrating to your people and to the external world what's been said is wrong? Or do you not? And again, I think it comes back to the central theme of you've got to wargame it. You've got to plan it, and just make sure that everybody understands clearly what their role is and what your response is going to be as an organization. And I think in the era of Trump, and it's quite a bizarre thing to sort of say, but it's almost a question of getting your key core decision makers together around the board table and stress testing your company culture and stress testing your values and really putting people on the spot and saying, if we're put under pressure around our D&I initiatives or our sustainability initiatives, as an example, because of the Trump administration or the prevailing kind of external narrative, are we going to hold our nerve or not? Or actually, are we going to go off in a different direction? And of course, those things then require different responses from us as kind of crisis communicators. I think that's probably enough, Claire, hopefully at this stage. But I think I'll hand over to Harry at this point.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Miles. That was really, really insightful. And hopefully others on the call, like me, feel somewhat reassured by the fact there is some kind of predictability or strategy to all of this, what feels a lot like chaos a lot of the time. So actually, I think stepping back, using that, what can we see, that blueprint to look at what might come next and using that to plan, I think that's a really good strategy for actually making it feel more manageable, even if there are a few kind of surprises along the way. So yeah, really, really helpful. Thank you, Miles. So next up, we've got Harry Methley, who is Senior Counsel at Connect PA. So he's held previously roles across government. So he was Special Advisor and Spokesman for the Home Secretary during Trump's first term. So a lot of really fascinating insight to come from that. Also worked in 10 Downing Street and in Conservative campaign headquarters, and is a fellow PRCA Public Affairs Board member. So Harry's going to share some insights from his career and help us understand what drives politicians and what lessons we might learn from Trump's first term in office. Thanks, Harry.
Thanks very much, Claire. I'm not going to repeat some of the things that Miles has said, but I agree on that very first point, that Trump 2.0 is very different from Trump's first go. There is a plan. There are things that his team are working through. They've spent the last 4 years looking and devising strategies to implement. We saw in that first 100 hours, it used to be the first 100 days of a US administration that they would work through. But actually with the executive orders, we saw that was an unprecedented level of action from a government. And it hits back to that point that it's vital for businesses to be ready and prepared. I think there's an interesting point on what can we learn from the UK government's approach. How have they handled Trump over the last few weeks? I think it's really clear they have to walk a tightrope with Trump. They want the growth that comes from US companies. They want the security that comes from the US military, but they also want this closer relationship with Europe, and they want to balance that with what the voters see as sometimes not favourable policies. Well, we see some of the things they've said about Peter Mandelson, the recalibration he did, where he walked back some of his previous comments on openly criticising Trump, to adjusting his stance live on Fox News, saying some of his remarks were ill-judged and ill-advised. And we've seen in recent days how Keir Starmer handled the diplomatic row with President Zelensky. There was no direct rebuke of President Trump, but there was calm, measured, careful response direct to Zelensky, which also kept in mind that Trump was part of the audience. One of the big things for any crisis comms team is to know when you actually have to say something. When I was in government, I worked for the Home Secretary, and she was on the media round the morning after the Capitol Hill riots. Now, that was an instance where we obviously had to say something, but it's something that I often bear in mind when advising clients. It's actually, you don't always have to say something. You don't always have to be the company that goes out there, unless, as Miles says, it's something that's really key to your views and your beliefs as an organization. There's another thing I think we often miss out on. I think we over here in the UK, we dismiss certain viewpoints outright. We say, well, actually, look, that's very American. It's not to do with us. People over here don't think that way. There was some polling by Opinion just in the new year. They blind tested some Trump's policies. They changed them slightly and they made them suitable for a UK audience. They didn't say they were Trump policies, and lots of them had support. So it's a really important thing in that actually audiences over here do think in similar ways to American audiences, but that Trump overlay can really blind people to how people are thinking. So rather than dismissing viewpoints outright, it's important that businesses are engaging and understanding with their whole customer base. One of a big debate amongst some corporates at the moment is how to engage with Reform UK. They've topped many of the polls in recent weeks. We know the next general elections are a long time away, but they have five MPs and they make a lot of noise in Westminster. They really help make the news, and they can really set directions. So it's vital that people are engaging with viewpoints they don't necessarily agree with. One of the points that Mars mentioned is how do we manage crisis in an era of misinformation? Social media is more fragmented than ever. Everyone's gone off to their own individual echo chambers. People have left Twitter and they've gone to Blue Sky or Mastodon, whereas other people are still on Twitter, and it's become a more right-wing echo chamber. But something that businesses really need to look at is where is our audience? If you're a local council, or if you're a bus operator, if you've still got people in your consumer base on Twitter, then they expect to find you there, and there is engagement to be missed if you don't do it properly. Misinformation spreads faster than any fact check. One of the key points we regularly advise our clients is to have their proof points ready. You'll all know this as crisis comms experts, but really making sure you've stress tested your arguments before you get to the point of issuing any message or rebuttal. Something that might work for an industry journalist who has a real complex understanding of your sector simply won't work anymore. It will be dissected on Twitter or on Facebook within minutes of you publishing it. So really think, step back from your messaging, step back from your narrative, and test how it's going to land with those audiences. And then the question you always have to ask yourself is, are you really in a crisis? One of the things which, unfortunately, my previous role at the Home Office, when you were dealing with national security incidents, the first question that we would ask officials would be, is anybody dead, or how many people are injured? Now, that's not to say that that's the only time a crisis gets triggered, but it's important to remember what those crisis levels are. As Miles says, you need to know and test those triggers. You can learn from politicians. One of the reasons they avoid responding to hypothetical questions is because we don't have all the details before you. There was what I think was a good example of crisis comms response last week, the week before last, from Politico, the news organization. They were called out by Elon Musk and Trump because many US officials were subscribing to their political pro services or receiving their newsletters. And the US administration said this was effectively, they were subsidizing Politico. It took Politico a couple of days to get a response out, but when they did, their response was very measured. It went to all their audiences. It directly rebutted the points that were made. And actually, that's sort of an argument that's died away. Their response managed to shut down the argument. And I think that's a great example of handling misinformation and disinformation in this second Trump term. And then finally, how can we prepare? As we've already said, lots of the changes and the policy shifts that Trump is talking about have been telegraphed. If you're in a heavily regulated industry, you don't need a full public affairs secretary equivalent is saying in America. Take, for example, the food and drink sector. We know what RFK Jr. has been saying about ultra-processed food. So track those key players. It's undoubtedly those arguments will translate over here before long. Differentiate between the noise and the substance, however. We've seen some examples, particularly on tariffs, where we haven't seen the policies flow through as quickly as some people may expected. And it's important that we don't have to, as organizations, you don't have to respond to those things that haven't yet happened. I suppose it goes to the point of as Miles was mentioning, about mastering your comms plans and your stakeholder engagement. Really, really test things out. Test those messages. Test those scenario planning. If you're working in steel, for example, you should know that there's a very high chance that the tariffs are coming. So what's that communication look like? What's that communication look like to your workforce? What's it look like to the trade unions? What's it look like to your communities? And again, remember that the government we have over here isn't the same as Trump. So you might be coming under a lot of pressure from stakeholders to respond to a latest Trump comment or a latest Trump initiative. But remember, the government over here is very, very different. As Miles said, they came to office promising the biggest overhaul in workers' rights in a generation. That isn't about rolling back DE&I initiatives. That's about securing strong, stable jobs in a unionized workforce. It's a very different landscape and agenda. I think the key in this Trump 2.0 agenda is speed and adaptability in responding to some of the things we've seen. So meeting your audience where they are and knowing when to take a stand, knowing when to sit out a debate, or knowing when you don't need to respond to everything. I think it comes back to that point about drawing your audience. Who really is your audience in that key moment when the crisis hits? Is it your workforce? Is it your investors? I think making sure you've got those fully formed plans to be able to deal with any crisis as they come is now more vital than ever for the crisis comms teams.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Harry. So yeah, the message that's very, very clearly coming through from both is like test, lots of planning, make sure that, whatever is coming your way, there is a lot of emotion and emotional kind of and divisive rhetoric that's, around Trump. But actually, like you say, Harry, about Politico taking a really measured and very factual response. I think we could probably all learn from that, because in that initial moment, it's so easy to get caught up in all that kind of emotion and drama and thinking about how it's going to divide people and how people are going to feel. But actually sticking to the facts of the matter is also something that's going to really help us get through here. So we're now into our Q&A section, and the questions are already rolling in. So that's awesome. So yeah, please keep adding those into the Q&A box. So I'm going to kick off with one here, which actually segues really nicely from Harry, what you were saying. So I've got an anonymous attendee says, Keir Starmer does not do a good job handling the public's perception of his government either. Don't you think there is already a crisis where the UK may be the weaker one in the special relationship? Will online media be a better approach to counter these challenges? Harry, do you feel like jumping in on this one? You're on mute.
I think there's a really interesting point there in how Keir Starmer is handling the public's perception of his government. I think if you look at the polling, people still don't understand what the government stands for. If I asked everyone on this call to write a short paragraph of what the government's narrative is, I think we would all come up with wildly different things. Whereas if you look back to the Boris Johnson government from that very first period pre-COVID, it was about sorting out Brexit. Everybody knew what the main focus of the government was. Now, the government will say their main focus is growth. The main objective that they are trying to deliver is economic growth to do all these following things for the public. You then get into their missions and their milestones. But growth means everything to everyone and different things to different people. I think one of the things we're going to see over the next year or so is the government starting to explain what growth means for real people. We saw some of it the other week when West Streeting had a big announcement that the government had met their first milestone on reducing NHS waiting lists. When we get to the point of saying, actually, this is what the government's mission is for normal people, this is how a bloke in the pub or a lady on the bus would understand what the government's trying to do. On your point about the special relationship, I think it's long-standing that the Americans have always had a more dominant role in that special relationship. I think some of the things that we can do to counter that are really making sure that we're a steadfast partner to America on other areas where we don't disagree with them. I think the Ukraine stuff is going to be very challenging, I think, and I hope that the government step up and play a bigger role within Europe. There was some stuff this morning around defense spending, and I think that will help solidify that relationship over the coming years.
Anything to add to that, Miles?
I mean, look, I think from an American perspective, special relationship or not, you need allies in the world, right? So despite this kind of inward-looking kind of America first agenda, for Trump to succeed and for America to succeed, it needs to carry people with them. And I think if I was advising the president at the moment, and you look across kind of Europe, we are the partner, right? We have a majority government, which is broadly stable, which has got four and a bit years left to run. And, we've seen the outcome of the German elections. We look at what's happening. Macron won't be around much longer. Everything else is sort of coalitions and sort of, built more on sand than I think what we've got here. So I think we are well placed to do that. And I think we are well placed to, as we have done previously, bridge literally across the Atlantic from the Americans, into Europe and into the European Union, which isn't something I would have said probably 12 months ago, but it looks like that relationship with Europe is going to change. So, I think we're in a good place, but I think Harry's absolutely right. I think it is inevitably fraught with difficulty. And I don't envy Starmer and Starmer's team. This is a really difficult line they're now having to toe here, especially kind of on Ukraine and on the foreign policy, because it looks like the outcome will be something that I think this government, our government, and indeed Europe doesn't really want and is going to find very difficult to stomach, but it might become a reality anyway. So, but I totally take the premise around kind of Starmer not being able to kind of explain what the government's for. I think just quickly, Claire, before we move on to the next question, I think the other way of sort of looking at that, to Harry's point about kind of speed, I think about the opposition. And there has been this kind of view from Team Kemi that we're going to go away and we're going to regroup and we're going to think about kind of where we're at, and then we're going to come out with some policy ideas in sort of 2027, 2028, and then we'll have a pitch ready to go for the next election in 2029. The speed point comes in here in British politics. You've got Reform, who Harry's already mentioned, saying lots of things. It may not end up being policy, they may not end up governing, but they're saying a lot of things which people are looking to the opposition to kind of respond to. So I think the idea of kind of opposition has changed as well. You don't have the luxury anymore of big policy commissions coming out with very long documents that are very well sort of thought through and evidenced in 3 or 4 years' time. Everything is immediate. People want to know what you stand for now. And it's interesting that she's already getting a degree of heat on kind of not really saying anything about anything, which I think is quite interesting.
Very true. We're all impatient. We want it all now, right? So another question here from Charles. A commentator was saying earlier that to avoid panic, we should focus on what Trump does as opposed to what he says. At what point should crisis comms teams activate their response? When he speaks or when he does? Either of you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think the most important point is what your audience is thinking. So if Trump says something that's going to have a major impact on your investors or your share price, then it's vital that they know that you have a plan to deal with it, that you're prepared. And ideally, some of the communication has been happening in advance. So, for example, if you're working in an industry that's or a sector that's liable to heavy regulatory change or tariffs, you've been telegraphing to your investors that you know who you're going to speak to in your government, that you have a plan to deal with the tariffs, and that you have a plan to deal with the regulatory changes, whether that be appointing lawyers. You can go all the way down judicial review routes on whatever it may be, but that you've got a plan to deal with it. If it's on that hypothetical point and it's for your customers or your clients, then you can take a little bit of a step back. I think it's that point in saying, look, we've seen this. It's very light on detail. We've got a plan, but we'll work it through as we get more information. But it's from my perspective, it's very much about looking at the audience there and what your audience expecting to hear from you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Miles, anything on that one?
I think that the understanding of kind of the practicalities as well, right? So, it is one thing firing off kind of executive orders. It's another thing trying to push a legislative agenda through, both houses in the States. It is a different system. So understanding how that system kind of works and what it kind of results in, I think is helpful. And that may mean that, teams here in the UK have got to lean into kind of their American counterparts, or they have to kind of go and acquire that kind of expertise. I mean, a lot of the things that he has said, or he has just sort of signed off on his desk using that big black thick pen that he uses to sign everything, is all now held up in the courts in various different states because, the judiciary in certain parts of America is going, well, actually, hang on a minute, I don't think so. We don't want that here. So it's not as clear cut as just he signs a piece of paper and stuff happens. I mean, I think he would like to govern like that. And I sometimes wonder whether he thinks that's kind of how it works. But of course, it's not. It's far more sort of complex. And Harry's point about bringing in all of that intelligence into the decision-making process, whether that be kind of audit and assurance, legal, other parts of kind of the corporate affairs family, I think is hugely important, because you do need that rounded view as to kind of actually what's possible and what's not. He doesn't have absolute authority, despite what you might read or what he might want, for example.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point about not one part of your comms response working in isolation. It's about getting that factual view and a rounded view.
Sorry, Claire, I just on that, I think I've literally in my notes here, I've written crisis comms is the hardest job I've ever had, and I've underlined it. And I think that's true. And I think that should probably be called out, because you have to understand the political kind of ramifications of some of this stuff. You have to be good at comms. You've probably done some stuff and a stint kind of doing some kind of media work, whether kind of regionally, nationally, or internationally. And you have to understand your business inside out. So you are exhibiting, all manner of qualities and skills to be able to kind of put this to good use, which is why I think I've written that down. So I think, as a group of crisis comms professionals, I think we should all pat ourselves on the back, because you do really have to work very hard at a lot of this stuff.
And I'd add some strong internal stakeholder management as well. I have to say, from my experience in managing crises, it's not always actually your external stakeholders, it's your internal that want to add a different viewpoint or are desperate to know who leaked something. Then I don't know, just all those kind of things that in the moment you're like, this just doesn't matter right now. So yeah, no, really, really fair point. That actually brings me on to a question that we've got in about how, Miles, you talked about resilience earlier. One of our attendees has asked, how can organisations build resilience in an ever-evolving landscape which is changing internally and externally? So segues really nicely actually from that point.
That's a very good question. I don't think there's kind of one set answer that kind of really, gets to the heart of that. I think some of the things I've talked about, those kind of hygiene factors, I think if you follow those, i.e. you have people trained up, you war game it, You know, that there is no substitute for experience. You know, bringing junior colleagues in to sort of sit alongside while this stuff is playing out, I always found to be really sort of very helpful and beneficial. Building a rota of people to kind of row in and support as well, I think is also really helpful. And it's looking after each other. I mean, I think, you know, as I sort of said in my opening remarks, it was not a popular decision at the time to enforce the rule across our corporate affairs team at Thames that everybody was going to have to join some kind of out of hours crisis comms rota. I mean, you can imagine how well that went down, how popular I was, you know, the following day. But you couldn't operate that model with 4 people. And you certainly couldn't operate that model with people that were just press officers. So everybody got involved and everybody got the training that they needed and everybody kind of understood what their response was. And it lessened the burden. You know, it wasn't the same people doing weekends or evenings and kind of, you know, constantly being put upon. I mean, we're talking at this time, you know, we were having operational failure, you know, weekly. I mean, this wasn't sort of you go on a rota and somebody might call you once a year. This was a real live and present thing that was happening all the time. And I think that helped. And I think just actually in peacetime, taking that step back and just checking in that everybody was all right and was managing this stuff, I think was really quite important. But it is hard. And I think you do have to look yourself in the mirror and ask yourself some difficult questions at points around, you know, are you okay and are you coping with this? And then just being able to signpost to the help that's available if you're not. I mean, as you know, Claire, I mean, the CIPR and the PRCA collectively run a mental health questionnaire for all of us practitioners every year. 23-24, so last year, 91% of respondents quoted poor mental health experience at some point over the preceding 12 months and cited stress as the main cause. Now, that should make everybody sort of sit up and take notice, because, you know, I'd love to say that these crises are going to die away. You know, we live in an age of permacrisis, right? It's one thing after the next. You know, and Trump is just sort of the latest thing to add to a long list of things that we've all kind of collectively dealt with. So I think we have kind of built up that resilience for kind of crisis comms, you know, just over the years by the nature of all the things that have happened. But I think just, you know, being there for each other is invaluable.
Just one point to add on your earlier point about resilience in planning is to really test the assumptions of who's going involved when things go wrong. So, you know, when I worked in the Home Office, I remember we had the press office playbooks of who would call who to let them know what's happening, and it was very nice, and it was a great organized pyramid of how information will flow to the top and who will speak to who. But actually, when a crisis happened, there were non-executive directors calling, other ministers getting involved, people from other directorates, people from other departments who would pop in and go, well, actually, we think this should happen. So when you're testing your crisis comms plan, sit down and go, okay, well, it's not just us in this room. We know we're going to be involved. We know we're going to be dealing and running the response. But who's going to walk through the door and go, oh, I've got some views? As Claire said, it's that managing and knowing your internal stakeholders. And they always manage to pop up at the worst possible time with advice that's probably not very helpful, as they don't understand the whole picture. So bringing them into some tabletop exercises, bringing really senior people who might not ever have anything to do with communications into your stress testing and your scenario practicing. That's a really important thing we often do.
Brilliant, thanks both. That's really helpful. Another question here about generally how big does the social media crisis communications team need to ideally be? And do you use tools to work on the public sentiment? So conscious that on that first question, it probably depends a lot on the size of your organisation, but maybe if you've got any insight from, you know, where you work now or previous experience of, you know, how many people have generally been in that team and how that's worked, that would be really helpful. Do you want to go first, Harry?
As Claire said, it really depends on your organization. I work with a FTSE 200, and their comms team is very small. It's 2 or 3 people, and then it's expanded out with wider support from us And then when a crisis happens, we come together as one team to sort of backfill in the roles that some people would have in-house for the whole year. At the Home Office, the team, the press office, there was over 100 people in the press and communications team there. But dealing specifically with social media, I think that's just one tool in the armory of any crisis response, and it's something people can tend to do as part of something else. The key in most crises is the response is consistent across platform, and actually being able to use platform management tools in any crisis is a really helpful thing. And yes, on public sentiment, I think that's a really important point in responding to any crisis. Sometimes as we were talking briefly about the Politico, I would love to see what their sentiment tools were saying in the days before they responded. And I imagine and expected it dropped off a cliff within the 2 days after, and now has returned to something slightly different than before, but will have definitely calmed down. So yeah, the public sentiment, it's really important as well to be able to look back on how you dealt with a crisis, and the sentiment tracking throughout a crisis is a key tool to be able to do that.
Are there any tools that you use with any of your clients?
We use lots of varying tools. Some of it's self-developed internally, and some of it's sales as a software as a service stuff that many of you will use.
Great. Miles, anything you want to add on that? How big is your crisis comms team for social media at Openreach, or how big was it at Thames Water? Is probably the
it's probably a better question, is it? I mean, I think on the sentiment tracking thing, I agree with everything Harry said. Quite right. I also think when you think about that kind of internal management, you can manage up how well you have dealt with an issue. So you will get a lot of, I'm sure everybody gets this, top down. Why didn't we say this? Why didn't we say that? Why didn't we say anything at all? I mean, it could be whatever. One of the difficulties that I've always found in all the roles I've had is how you demonstrate the value that you're adding, because a lot of the time we're trying to stop stuff happening and it's hard to put a value on that. So any data that you've got that you can point to, I think, is a good thing. In terms of Thames, I mean, again, herein lies quite an interesting kind of in-house corporate challenge, which is actually, where does your social media team sit? Right? Structurally, where does it sit? So Thames's social media team back in the day was a customer function. So it didn't sit within my remit, didn't sit within corporate affairs. It was very much somebody's message because their bill's wrong, or somebody's message because they need something fixed, or whatever the scenario was. And the team was relatively small, and it certainly didn't face into crises. So again, we had to sort of work on that. 1 became 4, and then social media got its own dedicated internal runway when we basically pulled it apart and redid it, because we gave it that importance, because that's where a lot of our customers were, but also where our senior stakeholders were. That is where we were getting a lot of the political kind of incoming was coming through on, as it was, Twitter at the time. I think one of the things that we learned, and picking up on Harry's point about that consistency of narrative, we wouldn't go to social first. So we redesigned and we rebuilt the web homepage. And if you go on their web homepage today, I think it exists, it's still there. There's a red incident bar. That's where it went first. So that was our channel with our message talking about our issue or our asset failure. And from that, it then went to social, press, stakeholders, but that was the one source of information. And we would always point people at that. And again, largely because, unlike the minute you post something on Twitter about kind of, 500,000 people not having a water supply, you know what you get next. If you put it on your web banner and it's very factual and this is what's happening, this is the reality, often with photos to kind of emphasize kind of how big some of this infrastructure was. This wasn't sort of, your garden tap leaking. We had engineers standing next to pipes which are the same size as a fully grown, man or woman. It is incredible. It started to kind of help us control the narrative of kind of what was going on. But it is an important part. I think back to the point around stress testing, though, there are conversations, obviously, that I think everybody is having around kind of what platforms to use. You know, Harry's mentioned some of the newer ones kind of on the scene. These things are only as good as the information that you can put into them, and they're only as good as the people that can staff them. So my advice would be, if you don't have the ability to do it and you don't have people to be able to continually share that message on social, don't start. Because I've seen it where we've started communicating something, that person's got busy doing this, this, and this in the middle of a crisis, and they've stopped communicating on that channel. It creates more problems for you in the long run. So it comes back to strategy, I think.
Harry, anything to add?
No, I don't think so. I agree with lots of that. I think one of the key things that lots of people forget is when you're dealing with a crisis internally, you're going out at update points when actually you've got something to say, something's changed. You can tell your customers, okay, we've made progress on repairing this, or we've made progress on repairing this. A lot of the time, something that it's a really important thing to do is to say, okay, it's an hour on since the previous update. Nothing's changed. We're still working on it, but we promise you we're still working on it. You can sometimes get so involved internally in what's happening and in the detail, you forget that there are people sat at home without electricity, or there are people without internet. And it's really important to say that over the last hour, our engineers have still been working on it, or over the last 2 weeks, we've been engaging with lawyers on this judicial review process, or whatever your crisis is that regular update, so people know things are still happening behind the scenes, even if it's not always good news.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it brings it back to your audience. Who are you trying to reassure or speak to? So so we've got about 5 minutes left. We've had, unsurprisingly, a few questions about the DEI positioning. So a question here: some US companies have announced that DEI efforts will continue unabated. Should companies stand firm on their DEI commitments and other key values, such as ESG, regardless of external pressures, or do they need to start reacting to the political landscape? Who's the brave person that wants to go first on that one? Big question.
I think a bit like we've sort of said already to a number of these kind of answers, and this isn't, to sort of fob the question off, but it depends. It depends. Who are you? What is your organization? What's your culture? What's your value structure? And understanding, once you sort of stress tested this internally right up to the level of an organization, what the appetite is to continue doing it. And then once you've made that decision, ideally you stick to it, because depending again on what organization you are, there's nothing worse than people or businesses seem to be sort of flip-flopping on things, or kind of being in tow to, the latest kind of, edict from the Trump administration or the Labour government, or kind of whatever that kind of narrative is. But it depends. What are your drivers as a business? What is it that the people making those difficult decisions that are paid the big bucks to do so, what matters? Is it the bottom line, and is it winning government contracts? And is there something which says, if you do this, you're not in the mix for this? What does that mean? What does that mean for your business and all the people that you employ? What does it mean morally? How much do you sort of invest into this? Do you have kind of networks, and like we do at Openreach, where people come together and sort of quite rightly sort of talk about their differences, whether that's kind of sort of cultural, neurodiversity, or gender, or whatever it is. But I don't think that's much of an answer, Claire, but it really does just depend on your sort of situation and your, as I say, your culture and your value system, really, as to what that kind of looks like.
Yeah, no, that's really fair. Harry?
Yeah, I would just add as well, it depends on what type of organization you are. If you're a campaigning organization, then certainly there are going to be things that happen anywhere in the world that your stakeholders expect you to respond to, as that's the nature of what you do. But if you're a FTSE or privately owned business, then sometimes you need to step back and remember. I think lots of people sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that their stakeholders are more or equally invested in our own social views as an organization. And sometimes it's really important to go, okay, well, internally, this might be really important, but actually for our customer, who's expecting to receive X product or buys our thing once a week, are they bothered? Do they think this is a waste of money on time? And this then goes back to that point of going, do you always have to say something? And on those occasions where you can say, well, actually, look, personally, I might feel very aggrieved by something, but is it the right thing for our organization or brand to be taking a stand on when most people will go, hey, hang on, why do they care about this? But obviously, of course, the counter there is campaigning organisations and some internal communications where you have staff that would really expect you to take views on things.
Yeah, that's very true. Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes left. So I'm thinking if we just use that time to maybe sum up sort of what your key takeaways are going to be, each of you, for this kind of, you know, communicating and crisis comms in this Trumpian era. Harry, what would be the key things that you would want our attendees today to take away?
I think firstly, it's recognizing that the landscape has shifted slightly, but it's not as unpredictable as people might like to think. I think we can prepare for these fast-moving policy shifts, keeping an eye on what's happening in America, because there's undoubtedly this stuff will flow over to here. And the second point is differentiating between noise and reality. So making sure that you're not responding to every tweet, or I'm not sure what they're called on Truth Social, but you don't have to respond to every Truth Social. You can cut out the ones and say, well, actually, this really matters for our business. And then finally, it's making sure that your crisis communication plans and your testing is really adapted to the fragmented and fast-moving landscape that we all find ourselves operating in 2025.
Brilliant. Thanks, Harry. Miles?
I agree with all of that. And I think two things. I think one, this is an art, not a science. And I think you just have to remember that, you know, it is that there is no one set way to do this. And I think reminding people, certainly at the top of organizations, everybody thinks they can do comms, right? So reminding them that there is a plan and a process and it's stress tested is I think super important. I think the other thing is just having that ability to just step back from all of this. It's emotive, it's a lot. And I think, you know, one of the things I sort of say to my team all the time is, you know, we trade on our impartiality. You know, otherwise, you know, you're sort of cutting your nose off to spite your face. You know, you're missing out on a whole section of things. It may get difficult. There may be things that you don't like. But being able to sort of step back from that, remove kind of the emotion from it and deal with the facts, and as we've discussed, that can be quite difficult as well, will stand you in really good stead going forward.
That is brilliant advice. Well, thank you both so much. Your insights have been really valuable. So hoping that everybody's really got a lot from that today. I certainly have scribbled down lots of notes, lots of things to think about and prepare for. But yeah, thank you very much, and see you all soon.